Totem and Taboo, Resemblances Between the Psychic Lives of Savages and Neurotics, by Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud. Authorized English translation with introduction by A. Brill. Introductory Notes. Author's Preface. The essays treated here appeared under the subtitle of this book in the first numbers of the periodical Imago, edited by me. They represent my first efforts to apply viewpoints and results of psychoanalysis to unexplained problems of racial psychology. In method, this book contrasts with that of W. Wundt and the works of the Zurich psychoanalytic school. The former tries to accomplish the same object through assumptions and procedures from non-analytic psychology, while the latter follow the opposite course and strive to settle problems of individual psychology by referring to material of racial psychology. I am pleased to say that the first stimulus for my own works came from these two sources. I am fully aware of the shortcomings of these essays. I shall not touch upon those which are characteristic of first efforts at investigation. The others, however, demand a word of explanation. The 4 essays which are here collected will be of interest to a wide circle of educated people, but they can only be thoroughly understood and judged by those who are really acquainted with psychoanalysis as such. It is hoped that they may serve as a bond between students of ethnology, philology, folklore, and of the allied sciences, and psychoanalysts. They cannot, however, supply both groups the entire requisites for such cooperation. They will not furnish the former with sufficient insight into the new psychological technique, nor will the psychoanalysts acquire through them an adequate command over the material to be elaborated. Both groups will have to content themselves with whatever attention they can stimulate here and there, and with the hope that frequent meetings between them will not remain unproductive for science. The 2 principal themes, Totem and Taboo, which gave the name to this small book, are not treated alike here. The problem of taboo is presented more exhaustively, and the effort to solve it is approached with perfect confidence. The investigation of totemism may be modestly expressed as, this is all that psychoanalytic study can contribute at present to the elucidation of the problem of totemism. This difference in the treatment of the 2 subjects is due to the fact that taboo still exists in our midst. To be sure, it is negatively conceived and directed to different contents, but according to its psychological nature, it is still nothing else than Kant's categorical imperative, which tends to act compulsively and rejects all conscious motivations. On the other hand, totemism is a religio-social institution which is alien to our present feelings. It has long been abandoned and replaced by new forms. In the religions, morals, and customs of the civilized races of today, it has left only slight traces, and even among those races where it is still retained, it has had to undergo great changes. The social and material progress of the history of mankind could obviously change taboo much less than totemism. In this book, the attempt is ventured to find the original meaning of totemism through its infantile traces, that is, through the indications in which it reappears in the development of our own children. The close connection between totem and taboo indicates the further paths to the hypothesis maintained here. And although this hypothesis leads to somewhat improbable conclusions, there is no reason for rejecting the possibility that it comes more or less near to the reality which is so hard to reconstruct. Translator's Introduction. When one reviews the history of psychoanalysis, one finds that it had its inception in the study of morbid mental states. Beginning with the observation of hysteria and the other neuroses, Professor Freud gradually extended his investigations to normal psychology and evolved new concepts and new methods of study. The neurotic symptoms were no longer imaginary troubles, the nature of which one could not grasp, but were conceived as mental and emotional maladjustments to one's environment. The stamp of degeneracy impressed upon neurotics by other schools of medicine was altogether eradicated. Deeper investigation showed conclusively that a person might become neurotic if subjected to certain environments, and that there was no definite dividing line between normal and abnormal. The hysterical symptoms, obsessions, doubts, phobias, as well as hallucinations of the insane, show the same mechanisms as those similar psychic structures which one constantly encounters in normal persons in the form of mistakes in talking, reading, writing, forgetting, dreams, and wit. The dream, always highly valued by the populace and as much despised by the educated classes, has a definite structure and meaning when subjected to analysis. Professor Freud's monumental work, The Interpretation of Dreams, marked a new epoch in the history of mental science. One might use the same words in reference to his profound analysis of wit. Faulty psychic actions, dreams, and wit are products of the unconscious mental activity, and like neurotic or psychotic manifestations, represent efforts at adjustment to one's environment. The slip of the tongue shows that on account of unconscious inhibitions, the individual concerned is unable to express his true thoughts. The dream is a distorted or plain expression of those wishes which are prohibited in the waking state, and the witticism, owing to its veiled or indirect way of expression, enables the individual to obtain pleasure from forbidden sources. But whereas dreams, witticisms, and faulty actions give evidences of inner conflicts which the individual overcomes, the neurotic or psychotic symptom is the result of a failure and represents a morbid adjustment. The aforementioned psychic formations are therefore nothing but manifestations of the struggle with reality, the constant effort to adjust one's primitive feelings to the demands of civilization. In spite of all later development, the individual retains all his infantile psychic structures. Nothing is lost. The infantile wishes and primitive impulses can always be demonstrated in the grown-up, and on occasion can be brought back to the surface. In his dreams, the normal person is constantly reviving his childhood, and the neurotic or psychotic individual merges back into a sort of psychic infantilism through his morbid productions. The unconscious mental activity, which is made up of repressed infantile material, forever strives to express itself. Whenever the individual finds it is impossible to dominate the difficulties of the world of reality, there is a regression to the infantile, and psychic disturbances ensue which are conceived as peculiar thoughts and acts. Thus, the civilized adult is the result of his childhood, or the sum total of his early impressions. Psychoanalysis thus confirms the old saying, "The child is father to the man." It is at this point in the development of psychoanalysis that the paths gradually broadened until they finally culminated in this work. There were many indications that the childhood of the individual showed a marked resemblance to the primitive history or the childhood of races. The knowledge gained from dream analysis and fantasies, when applied to the production of racial fantasies, like myths and fairy tales, seem to indicate that the first impulse to form myths was due to the same emotional strivings which produce dreams, fancies, and symptoms. Further study in this direction has shown much light on our great cultural institutions, such as religion, morality, law, and philosophy, all of which Professor Freud has modestly formulated in this volume, and thus initiated a new epoch in the study of racial psychology. I take great pleasure acknowledging my indebtedness to Mr. Alfred B. Kuttner for the invaluable assistance he rendered in the translation of this work. A. Brill. End of the introductory notes. Chapter 1. The Savage's Dread of Incest. Primitive man is known to us by the stages of development through which he has passed, that is, through the inanimate monuments and implements which he has left behind for us. through our knowledge of his art, his religion, and his attitude towards life, which we have received either directly or through the mediums of legends, myths, and fairy tales, and through the remnants of his ways of thinking that survive in our own manners and customs. Moreover, in a certain sense, he is still our contemporary. There are people whom we still consider more closely related to primitive man than to ourselves, in whom we therefore recognize the direct descendants and representatives of earlier man. We can thus judge the so-called savage and semi-savage races. Their psychic life assumes a peculiar interest for us, for we can recognize in their psychic life a well-preserved early stage of our own development. If this assumption is correct, a comparison of the psychology of primitive races, as taught by folklore, with the psychology of the neurotic, as it has become known through psychoanalysis, will reveal numerous points of correspondence and throw new light on subjects that are more or less familiar to us. For outer as well as for inner reasons, I am choosing for this comparison those tribes which have been described by ethnographists as being most backward and wretched, the aborigines of the youngest continent, namely Australia, whose fauna has also preserved for us so much that is archaic and no longer to be found elsewhere. The aborigines of Australia are looked upon as a peculiar race, which shows neither physical nor linguistic relationship with its nearest neighbors, the Melanesian, Polynesian, and Malayan races. They do not build houses or permanent huts. They do not cultivate the soil or keep any domestic animals except dogs, and they do not even know the art of pottery. They live exclusively on the flesh of all sorts of animals which they kill in the chase, and on the roots which they dig. Kings or chieftains are unknown among them, and all communal affairs are decided by the elders in assembly. It is quite doubtful whether they evince any traces of religion in the form of worship of higher beings. The tribes living in the interior, who have to contend with the greatest vicissitudes of life owing to a scarcity of water, seem in every way more primitive than those who live near the coast. We surely would not expect that these poor naked cannibals should be moral in their sex life according to our ideas, or that they should have imposed a high degree of restriction upon their sexual impulses. And yet we learn that they have considered it their duty to exercise the most searching care and the most painful rigor in guarding against incestuous sexual relations. In fact, their whole social organization seems to serve this object, or to have been brought into relation with its attainment. Among the Australians, the system of totemism takes the place of all religious and social institutions. Australian tribes are divided into small septs, or clans, each taking the name of its totem. Now, what is a totem? As a rule, it is an animal, either edible and harmless, or dangerous and feared. Most rarely the totem is a plant, or a force of nature, rain or water, which stands in a peculiar relation to the whole clan. The totem is first of all the tribal ancestor of the clan, as well as its tutelary spirit and protector. It sends oracles, and though otherwise dangerous, the totem knows and spares its children. The members of a totem are therefore under a sacred obligation not to kill, destroy their totem, to abstain from eating its meat or from any other enjoyment of it. Any violation of these prohibitions is automatically punished. The character of a totem is inherent not only in a single animal or a single being, but in all the members of the species. From time to time, festivals are held at which the members of a totem represent or imitate in ceremonial dances the movements and characteristics of their totem. The totem is hereditary either through the maternal or the paternal line. Maternal transmission probably always preceded and was only later supplanted by the paternal. The attachment to a totem is the foundation of all social obligations of an Australian. It extends on the one hand beyond the tribal relationship, and on the other hand it supersedes consanguineous relationships. The totem is not limited to district or locality. The members of a totem may live separated from one another and on friendly terms with adherents of other totems. Footnote. This very brief extract of the totemic system cannot be left without some elucidation and without discussing its limitations. The name totem or totem was first learned from the North American Indians by the Englishman J. Long in 1791. The subject has gradually acquired great scientific interest and has called forth a copious literature. I refer especially to Totemism and Exogamy by J. G. Fraser, 4 volumes, 1910, and the books and articles of Andrew Lang, for example, The Secret of Totem, 1905. The credit for having recognized the significance of totemism for the ancient history of man belongs to the Scotchman J. Ferguson MacLennan. Exterior to Australia, totemic institutions were found and are still observed among North American Indians, as well as among the races of the Polynesian island group, in East India, and in a large part of Africa. Many traces and survivals otherwise hard to interpret lead to the conclusion that totemism also once existed among the aboriginal Aryan and Semitic races of Europe, so that many investigators are inclined to recognize in totemism a necessary phase of human development through which every race has passed. How then did prehistoric man come to acquire a totem? That is, how did he come to make his descent from this or that animal foundation of his social duties, and, as we shall hear, of his sexual restrictions as well? Many different theories have been advanced to explain this, a review of which the reader may find in Wundt's Völkerpsychologie, Volume 2, Mythos und Religion. I promise soon to make the problem of totemism a subject of special study, in which an effort will be made to solve it by applying the psychoanalytic method. Not only is the theory of totemism controversial, but the very facts concerning it are hardly to be expressed in such general statements as were attempted above. There is hardly an assertion to which one would not have to add exceptions and contradictions. But it must not be forgotten that even the most primitive and conservative races are in a certain sense old, and have a long period behind them during which whatever was aboriginal with them has undergone much development and distortion. Thus among those races who still evince it, we find totemism today in the most manifold states of decay and disintegration. We observe that fragments of it have passed over to other social and religious institutions, where it may exist in fixed forms but far removed from its original nature. The difficulty then consists in the fact that it is not altogether easy to decide what in the actual conditions is to be taken as a faithful copy of the significant past and what is to be considered as a secondary distortion of it. End footnote. And now, finally, we must consider that peculiarity of the totemic system which attracts the interest of the psychoanalyst. Almost everywhere the totem prevails, there also exists the law that the members of the same totem are not allowed to enter into sexual relations with each other, that is, that they cannot marry each other. This represents the exogamy which is associated with totem. This sternly maintained prohibition is very remarkable. There is nothing to account for it in anything that we have hitherto learned from the conception of the totem or from any of its attributes. That is, we do not understand how it happened to enter the system of totemism. We are therefore not astonished if some investigators simply assume that at first exogamy, both as to its origin and to its meaning, have nothing to do with totemism, but that it was added to it at some time without any deeper association, when marriage restrictions proved necessary. However that may be, the association of totemism and exogamy exists, and proves to be very strong. Let us elucidate the meaning of this prohibition through further discussion. A. The violation of the prohibition is not left to what is, so to speak, an automatic punishment, as is the case with other prohibitions of the totem, for example, not to kill the totem animal, but is most energetically avenged by the whole tribe, as if it were a question of warding off a danger that threatens the community as a whole, or a guilt that weighs upon all. A few sentences from Fraser's book will show how seriously such trespasses are treated by these savages, who, according to our standard, are otherwise very immoral. Quote, in Australia, the regular penalty for sexual intercourse with a person of a forbidden clan is death. It matters not whether the woman is of the same local group or has been captured in war from another tribe. A man of the wrong clan who uses her as his wife is hunted down and killed by his clansmen, and so is the woman. Though in some cases, if they succeed in eluding capture for a certain time, the offence may be condoned. In the Tata-Thai tribe, New South Wales, in the rare cases which occur, the man is killed, but the woman is only beaten or speared, or both, till she is nearly dead. The reason given for not actually killing her being that she was probably coerced. Even in casual amours, the clan prohibitions are strictly observed. Any violations of these prohibitions are regarded with the utmost abhorrence and are punished by death." Unquote. B. As the same severe punishment is also meted out for temporary love affairs which have not resulted in childbirth, the assumption of other motives, perhaps of a practical nature, becomes improbable. C. As the totem is hereditary and is not changed by marriage, the results of the prohibition, for instance in the case of maternal heredity, are easily perceived. If, for example, the man belongs to a clan with the totem of the kangaroo and marries a woman of the emu totem, the children, both boys and girls, are all emu. According to the totem law, incestuous relations with his mother and sister, who are emu like himself, are therefore made impossible for a son of this marriage. Footnote. But the father, who is a kangaroo, is free, at least under this prohibition, to commit incest with his daughters, who are emu. In the case of a paternal inheritance of the totem, the father would be kangaroo as well as his children. Then incest with the daughter would be forbidden to the father, and incest with the mother would be left open to the son. These consequences of the totem prohibition seem to indicate that the maternal inheritance is older than the paternal one, for there are grounds for assuming that the totem prohibitions are directed first of all against the incestuous desires of the son. D. But we need only a reminder to realize that the exogamy connected with the totem accomplishes more, that is, aims at more than the prevention of incest with the mother or sisters. It also makes it impossible for the man to have sexual union with all the women of his own group, with a number of females, therefore, who are not consanguineously related to him, by treating all these women like blood relations. The psychological justification for this extraordinary restriction, which far exceeds anything comparable to it among civilized races, is not at first evident. All we seem to understand is that the role of the totem, the animal, as ancestor, is taken very seriously. Everybody descended from the same totem is consanguineous, that is, of one family, and in this family the most distant grades of relationship are recognized as an absolute obstacle to sexual union. Thus these savages reveal to us an unusually high grade of incest dread or incest sensitiveness, combined with the peculiarity, which we do not very well understand, of substituting the totem relationship for the real blood relationship. But we must not exaggerate this contradiction too much, and let us bear in mind that the totem prohibitions include real incest as a special case. In what manner the substitution of the totem group for the actual family has come about remains a riddle, the solution of which is perhaps bound up in the explanation of the totem itself. Of course, it must be remembered that with a certain freedom of sexual intercourse, extending beyond the limitations of matrimony, the blood relationship, and with it also the prevention of incest, becomes so uncertain that we cannot dispense with some other basis for the prohibition. It is therefore not superfluous to note that the customs of Australians recognize social conditions and festive occasions at which the exclusive conjugal right of a man to a woman is violated. The linguistic custom of these tribes, as well as most totem races, reveals a peculiarity which undoubtedly is pertinent in this connection. For the designations of relationship of which they make use do not take into consideration the relation between two individuals, but between an individual and his group. They belong, according to the expression of L.H. Morgan, to the classifying system. That means that a man calls not only his begetter father, but also every other man who, according to the tribal regulations, might have married his mother and thus become his father. He calls mother not only the woman who bore him, but also every other woman who might have become his mother without violation of the tribal laws. He calls brothers and sisters not only the children of his real parents, but also the children of all the persons named who stand in the parental group relation with him, and so on. The kinship names which two Australians give each other do not therefore necessarily point to a blood relationship between them, as they would have to according to the custom of our language. They signify much more the social than the physical relations. An approach to this classifying system is perhaps to be found in our nursery, when the child is induced to greet every male and female friend of the parents as uncle and aunt. Or it may be found, in a transferred sense, when we speak of brothers in Apollo or sisters in Christ. The explanation of this linguistic custom, which seems so strange to us, is simple if looked upon as a remnant and indication of those marriage institutions which the Rev. L. Fison has called group marriage, characterized by a number of men exercising conjugal rights over a number of women. The children of this group marriage would then rightly look upon each other as brothers and sisters, although not born of the same mother, and would take all the men of the group for their fathers. Although a number of authors, as for instance B. Westermarck in his History of Human Marriage, oppose the conclusions which others have drawn from the existence of group relationship names, the best authorities on the Australian savages are agreed that the classificatory relationship names must be considered as survivals from the period of group marriages. And according to Spencer and Gillen, in the Native Tribes of Central Australia, 1899, a certain form of group marriage can be established as still existing today among the tribes of the Urubuna and the Dieri. Group marriage, therefore, preceded individual marriage among these races, and did not disappear without leaving distinct traces in language and custom. But if we replace individual marriage, we can then grasp the apparent excess of cases of incest shunning which we have met among these same races. The totem exogamy, or prohibition of sexual intercourse between members of the same clan, seemed the most appropriate means for the prevention of group incest, and this totem exogamy then became fixed and long survived its original motivation. Although we believe that we understand the motives of the marriage restrictions among the Australian savages, we have still to learn that the actual conditions reveal a still more bewildering complication. For there are only few tribes in Australia which show no other prohibition besides the totem barrier. Most of them are so organized that they fall into two divisions which have been called marriage classes or phratries. Each of these marriage groups is exogamous and includes a majority of totem groups. Usually each marriage group is again divided into two subclasses, sub-phratries, and the whole tribe is therefore divided into 4 classes, the subclasses thus standing between the phratries and the totem groups. The typical and often very intricate scheme of organization of an Australian tribe therefore looks as follows. This is a description of the illustration that is within the text here. There are 3 levels to the illustration. The first level is labeled phratries and has 2 divisions, small letter A and small letter B. Stemming from A are 2 elements, small letter C and small letter D. From small b extend 2 elements, letter E and letter F. C, D, E, and F are labeled subphratries. From each of C, D, E, and F, 3 further subcategories. From C, alpha, beta, and gamma. From D, delta, epsilon, and eta. From E, 1, 2, and 3. From F, 4, 5, and 6. These last 12 are labeled totem. There is a dotted arcing line running from C to E and another from D to F. End description of the illustration. The 12 totem groups are brought under 4 subclasses and 2 main classes. All the divisions are exogamous. The subclass C forms an exogamous union with E, and the subclass D with F. The success or the tendency of these arrangements is quite obvious. They serve as a further restriction on the marriage choice and on sexual freedom. If there were only these 12 totem groups, assuming the same number of people in each group, every member of a group would have 11/12 of all the women of the tribe to choose from. The existence of the two phratries reduces this number to 6/12 or 1/2. A man of the totem alpha can only marry a woman from the groups 1 to 6. With the introduction of the two subclasses, the selection sinks to 3/12 or 1/4. A man of the totem alpha must limit his marriage choice to the women of the totems 4, 5, or 6. The historical relations of the marriage classes, of which there are found as many as 8 in some tribes, are quite unexplained. We only see that these arrangements seek to attain the same object as the totem exogamy, and even strive for more. But whereas the totem exogamy makes the impression of a sacred statute which sprang into existence no one knows how, and is therefore a custom, the complicated institutions of the marriage classes, with their subdivisions and the conditions attached to them, seem to spring from legislation with a definite aim in view. They have perhaps taken up afresh the task of incest prohibition, because the influence of the totem was on the wane. And while the totem system is, as we know, the basis of all other social obligations and moral restrictions of the tribe, the importance of the phratries generally ceases when the regulation of the marriage choice at which they aimed has been accomplished. In the further development of the classification of the marriage system, there seems to be a tendency to go beyond the prevention of natural and group incest, and to prohibit marriage between more distant group relations, in a manner similar to the Catholic Church, which extended the marriage prohibitions always in force for brothers and sisters to cousins, and invented for them the grades of spiritual kinship. It would hardly serve our purpose to go into the extraordinarily intricate and unsettled discussion concerning the origin and significance of the marriage classes, or to go more deeply into their relation to totemism. It is sufficient for our purposes to point out the great care expended by the Australians, as well as by other savage people, to prevent incest. We must say that these savages are even more sensitive to incest than we, perhaps because they are more subject to temptations than we are, and hence require more extensive protection against them. But the incest dread of these races does not content itself with the creation of the institutions described, which in the main seem to be directed against group incest. We must add a series of customs which watch over the individual behavior to near relatives in our sense, which are maintained with almost religious severity, and of whose object there can hardly be any doubt. These customs or custom prohibitions may be called avoidances. They spread far beyond the Australian totem races, but here again I must ask the reader to be content with a fragmentary excerpt from the abundant material. Such restrictive prohibitions are directed in Melanesia against the relations of boys with their mothers and sisters. Thus, for instance, on Leper's Island, one of the New Hebrides, the boy leaves his maternal home at a fixed age and moves to the clubhouse, where he then regularly sleeps and takes his meals. He may still visit his home to ask for food, but if his sister is at home he must go away before he has eaten. If no sister is about, he may sit down to eat near the door. If brother and sister meet by chance in the open, she must run away or turn aside and conceal herself. If the boy recognizes certain footprints in the sand as his sister's, he is not to follow them, nor is she to follow his. He will not even mention her name, and will guard against using any current word if it forms part her name. This avoidance, which begins with the ceremony of puberty, is strictly observed for life. The reserve between mother and son increases with age, and generally is more obligatory on the mother's side. If she brings him something to eat, she does not give it to him herself, but puts it down before him, nor does she address him in the familiar manner of mother and son, but uses the formal address. Similar customs attain in New Caledonia. If brother and sister meet, she flees into the bush, and he passes by without turning his head toward her. On the Gazella Peninsula in New Britain, a sister, beginning with her marriage, may no longer speak with her brother, nor does she utter his name, but designates him by means of a circumlocution. In New Mecklenburg some cousins are subject to such restrictions, which also apply to brothers and sisters. They may neither approach each other, shake hands, nor give each other presents, though they may talk to each other at a distance of several paces. The penalty for incest with a sister is death through hanging. These rules of avoidance are especially severe in the Fiji Islands, where they concern not only consanguineous sisters, but group sisters as well. To hear that these savages hold sacred orgies in which persons of just these forbidden degrees of kinship seek sexual union would seem still more peculiar to us, if we did not prefer to make use of this contradiction to explain the prohibition instead of being astonished at it. Among the Batas of Sumatra, these laws of avoidance affect all near relationships. For instance, it would be most offensive for a Batan to accompany his own sister to an evening party. A brother will feel most uncomfortable in the company of his sister, even when other persons are also present. If either comes into the house, the other prefers to leave. Nor will a father remain alone in the house with his daughter any more than the mother with her son. The Dutch missionary who reported these customs added that unfortunately he had to consider them well founded. It is assumed without question by these races that a man and a woman left alone together will indulge in the most extreme intimacy, and as they expect all kinds of punishments and evil consequences from their consanguineous intercourse, they do quite right to avoid all temptations by means of such prohibitions. Among the Barongos in Delagoa Bay in Africa, the most rigorous precautions are directed, curiously enough, against the sister-in-law, the wife of the brother of one's own wife. If a man meets this person, who is so dangerous to him, he carefully avoids her. He does not dare to eat out of the same dish with her, he speaks only timidly to her, does not dare to enter her hut, and greets her only with a trembling voice. Among the Akamba or Wakamba in British East Africa, a law of avoidance is in force which one would have expected to encounter more frequently. A girl must carefully avoid her own father between the time of her puberty and her marriage. She hides herself if she meets him on the street, and never attempts to sit down next to him, behaving in this way right up to her engagement. But after her marriage no further obstacle is put in the way of social intercourse with her father. The most widespread and strictest avoidance, which is perhaps the most interesting one for civilized races, is that which restricts the social relations between a man and his mother-in-law. It is quite general in Australia, but it is also in force among the Melanesian, Polynesian, and Negro races of Africa, as far as the traces of totemism and group relationship reach, and probably further still. Among some of these races similar prohibitions exist against the harmless social intercourse of a wife with her father-in-law, but these are by far not so constant or so serious. In a few cases both parents-in-law become objects of avoidance. As we are less interested in the ethnographic dissemination than in the substance and the purpose of the mother-in-law avoidance, I will here also limit myself to a few examples. On the Banks Island, these prohibitions are very severe and painfully exact. A man will avoid the proximity of his mother-in-law as she avoids his. If they meet by chance on a path, the woman steps aside and turns her back until he is passed, or he does the same. In Vanalava, or Port Patterson, a man will not even walk behind his mother-in-law along the beach until the rising tide has washed away the trace of her footsteps. But they may talk to each other at a certain distance. It is quite out of the question that he should ever pronounce the name of his mother-in-law, or she his. On the Solomon Islands, beginning with his marriage, a man must neither see nor speak with his mother-in-law. If he meets her, he acts as if he did not know her, and runs away as fast as he can in order to hide himself. Among the Zulu Kaffirs, custom demands that a man should be ashamed of his mother-in-law, and that he should do everything to avoid her company. He does not enter a hut in which she is, and when they meet he or she goes aside, she perhaps hiding behind a bush, while he holds his shield before his face. If they cannot avoid each other, and the woman has nothing with which to cover herself, she at least binds a bunch of grass around her head in order to satisfy the ceremonial requirements. Communication between them must either be made through a third person, or else they may shout at each other at a considerable distance, if they have some barrier between them, as, for instance, the enclosure of a kraal. Neither may utter the other's name. Among the Basogas, a Negro tribe living in the region of the Nile sources, a man may talk to his mother-in-law only if she is in another room of the house and is not visible to him. Moreover, this race abominates incest to such an extent as not to let it go unpunished even among domestic animals. Whereas all observers have interpreted the purpose and meaning of the avoidances between near relatives as protective measures against incest, different interpretations have been given for those prohibitions which concern the relationship with the mother-in-law. It was quite incomprehensible why all these races should manifest such great fear of temptation on the part of the man for an elderly woman old enough to be his mother. The same objection was also raised against the conception of Fison, who called attention to the fact that certain marriage class systems show a gap in that they make marriage between a man and his mother-in-law theoretically not impossible, and that a special guarantee was therefore necessary to guard against this possibility. Sir J. Lubbock, in his book The Origin of Civilization, traces back the behavior of the mother-in-law toward the son-in-law to the former marriage by capture. As long as the capture of women actually took place, the indignation of the parents was probably serious enough. When nothing but symbols of this form of marriage survived, the indignation of the parents was also symbolized, and thus custom continued after its origin had been forgotten." Crawley has found it easy to show how little this tentative explanation agrees with the details of actual observation. E.B. Tylor thinks that the treatment of the son-in-law on the part of the mother-in-law is nothing more than a form of cutting on the part of the woman's family. The man counts as a stranger, and this continues until the first child is born. But even if no account is taken of cases in which this last condition does not remove the prohibition, this explanation is subject to the objection that it does not throw any light on the custom dealing with the relation between mother-in-law and son-in-law, thus overlooking the sexual factor, and that it does not take into account the almost sacred loathing which finds expression in the laws of avoidance. A Zulu woman who was asked about the basis for this prohibition showed great delicacy of feeling in her answer. "It is not right that he should see the breasts which nursed his wife." It is known that also among civilized races the relation of son-in-law and mother-in-law belongs to one of the most difficult sides of family organization. Although laws of avoidance no longer exist in the society of the white races of Europe and America, much quarreling and displeasure would often be avoided if they did exist and did not have to be re-established by individuals. Many a European would see an act of high wisdom in the laws of avoidance which savage races have established to preclude any understanding between two persons who have become so closely related. There is hardly any doubt that there is something in the psychological situation of mother-in-law and son-in-law which furthers hostilities between them and renders living together difficult. The fact that the witticisms of the civilized races show such a preference for this very mother-in-law theme seems to me to point to the fact that the emotional relations between mother-in-law and son-in-law are controlled by components which stand in sharp contrast to each other. I mean that the relationship is really ambivalent, that is, it is composed of conflicting feelings of tenderness and hostility. A certain part of these feelings is evident. The mother-in-law is unwilling to give up the possession of her daughter. She distrusts the stranger to whom her daughter has been delivered, and shows a tendency to maintain the dominating position to which she became accustomed at home. On the part of the man there is the determination not to subject himself any longer to any foreign will, his jealousy of all persons who preceded him in the possession of his wife's tenderness, and last but not least his aversion to being disturbed in his illusion of sexual overvaluation. As a rule, such a disturbance emanates for the most part from his mother-in-law, who reminds him of her daughter through so many common traits, but who lacks all the charm of youth, such as beauty, and that psychic spontaneity which makes his wife precious to him. The knowledge of hidden psychic feelings which psychoanalytic investigation of individuals has given us makes it possible to add other motives to the above. Where the psychosexual needs of the woman are to be satisfied in marriage and family life, there is always the danger of dissatisfaction through the premature termination of the conjugal relation and the monotony of the wife's emotional life. The aging mother protects herself against this by living through the lives of her children, by identifying herself with them and making their emotional experiences her own. Parents are said to remain young with their children, and this is in fact one of the most valuable psychic benefits which parents derive from their children. Childlessness thus eliminates one of the best means to endure necessary resignation imposed upon the individual through marriage. This emotional identification with the daughter may easily go so far with the mother that she falls in love with the man her daughter loves, which leads in extreme cases to severe forms of neurotic ailments on account of the violent psychic resistance against this emotional predisposition. At all events, the tendency to such infatuation is very frequent with the mother-in-law, and either this infatuation itself or the tendency opposed to it joins the conflict of contending forces in the psyche of the mother-in-law. Very often it is just this harsh and sadistic component of the love emotion which is turned against the son-in-law in order better to suppress the forbidden tender feelings. The relation of the husband to his mother-in-law is complicated through similar feelings, which however spring from other sources. The path of object selection has normally led him to his love object through the image of his mother and perhaps of his sister. In consequence of the incest barriers, his preference for these two beloved persons of his childhood has been deflected, and he is then able to find their image in strange objects. He now sees the mother-in-law taking the place of his own mother and of his sister's mother, and there develops a tendency to return to the primitive selection against which everything in him resists. His incest dread demands that he should not be reminded of the genealogy of his love selection. The actuality of his mother-in-law, whom he had not known all his life like his mother, so that her picture can be preserved unchanged in his unconscious, facilitates this rejection. An added mixture of irritability and animosity in his feelings leads us to suspect that the mother-in-law actually represents an incest temptation for the son-in-law, just as it not infrequently happens that a man falls in love with his subsequent mother-in-law before his inclination is transferred to her daughter. I see no objection to the assumption that it is just this incestuous factor of the relationship which motivates the avoidance between son and mother-in-law among savages. Among the explanations for the avoidances which these primitive races observe so strictly, we would therefore give preference to the opinion originally expressed by Fison, who sees nothing in these regulations but a protection against possible incest. This would also hold good for all the other avoidances between those related by blood or by marriage. There is only one difference, namely, in the first case the incest is direct, so that the purpose of the prevention might be conscious. In the other case, which includes the mother-in-law relation, the incest would be a fantasy temptation brought about by unconscious intermediary links. We have had little opportunity in this exposition to show that the facts of folk psychology can be seen in a new light through the application of the psychoanalytic point of view, for the incest dread of savages has long been known as such, and is in need of no further interpretation. What we can add to the further appreciation of incest dread is the statement that it is a subtle infantile trait and is in striking agreement with the psychic life of the neurotic. Psychoanalysis has taught us that the first object selection of the boy is of an incestuous nature, and that it is directed to the forbidden objects, the mother and the sister. Psychoanalysis has taught us also the methods through which the maturing individual frees himself from these incestuous attractions. The neurotic, however, regularly presents to us a piece of psychic infantilism. He has either not been able to free himself from the childlike conditions of psychosexuality, or else he has returned to them, inhibited development and regression. Hence, the incestuous fixations of the libido still play, or again are playing, the main role in his unconscious psychic life. We have gone so far as to declare that the relation to the parents instigated by incestuous longings is the central complex of the neurosis. This discovery of the significance of incest for the neurosis naturally meets with the most general incredulity on the part of the grown-up, normal man. A similar rejection will also meet the researches of Otto Rank, which show in even larger scope to what extent the incest theme stands in the center of poetical interest, and how it forms the material of poetry in countless variations and distortions. We are forced to believe that such a rejection is above all the product of man's deep aversion to his former incest wishes, which have since succumbed to repression. It is therefore of importance to us to be able to show that man's incest wishes, which later are destined to become unconscious, are still felt to be dangerous by savage races who consider them worthy of the most severe defensive measures. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Taboo and the Ambivalence of Emotions. Part 1. Section 1. Taboo is a Polynesian word, the translation of which provides difficulties for us because we no longer possess the idea which it connotes. It was still current with the ancient Romans. Their word sacer was the same as the taboo of the Polynesians. The agos of the Greeks and the kodesh of the Hebrews must also have signified the same thing, which the Polynesians expressed through their word taboo, and what many races in America, Africa, Madagascar, northern and central Asia express through analogous designations. For us, the meaning of taboo branches off into two opposite directions. On the one hand, it means to us sacred, consecrated, but on the other hand, it means uncanny, dangerous, forbidden, and unclean. The opposite of taboo is designated in Polynesian by the word noa. This signifies something ordinary and generally accessible. Thus, something like the concept of reserve inheres in taboo. Taboo expresses itself essentially in prohibitions and restrictions. Our combinations of holy dread would often express the meaning of taboo. The taboo restrictions are different from religious or moral prohibitions. They are not traced to a commandment of a god, but really they themselves impose their own prohibitions. They are differentiated from moral prohibitions by failing to be included in a system which declares abstinences in general to be necessary and gives reasons for this necessity. The taboo prohibitions lack all justification and are of unknown origin. Though incomprehensible to us, they are taken as a matter of course by those who are under their dominance. Wundt calls taboo the oldest unwritten code of law of humanity. It is generally assumed that taboo is older than the gods and goes back to the pre-religious age. As we are in need of an impartial presentation of the subject of taboo before subjecting it to psychoanalytic consideration, I shall now cite an excerpt from the article Taboo in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, written by the anthropologist Northcote W. Thomas. Footnote: 11th edition. This article also gives the most important references. End footnote. Quote, properly speaking, taboo includes only a. the sacred or unclean character of persons or things, b. the kind of prohibition which results from this character, and c. the sanctity or uncleanliness which results from a violation of the prohibition. The converse of taboo in Polynesia is noa, and allied forms which mean general or common. Various classes of taboo in the wider sense may be distinguished. 1. Natural or direct, the result of mana, mysterious power, inherent in a person or thing. 2. Communicated or indirect, equally the result of mana, but a. acquired or b. imposed by a priest, chief, or other person. 3. Intermediate, where both factors are present, as in the appropriation of a wife to her husband. The term taboo is also applied to ritual prohibitions of a different nature, but its use in these senses is better avoided. It might be argued that the term should be extended to embrace cases in which the sanction of the prohibition is the creation of a god or spirit, that is, to religious interdictions as distinguished from magical. But there is neither automatic action nor contagion in such a case, and a better term for it is religious interdiction. The objects of taboo are many. 1. Direct taboos aim at a. protection of important persons, chiefs, priests, etc., and things against harm. b. Safeguarding of the weak. women, children, and common people generally, from the powerful mana, magical influence, of chiefs and priests. C. Providing against the dangers incurred by handling or coming in contact with corpses, by eating certain food, etc. D. Guarding the chief acts of life, births, initiation, marriage, and sexual functions, against interference. E. Securing human beings against the wrath or power of gods and spirits. Footnote. This application of the taboo can be omitted as not originally belonging in this connection. End footnote. F. Securing unborn infants and young children who stand in a specially sympathetic relation with their parents from the consequences of certain actions, and more especially from the communication of qualities supposed to be derived from certain foods. 2. Taboos are imposed in order to secure against thieves the property of an individual, his fields, tools, etc. End quote. Other parts of the article may be summarized as follows. Originally, the punishment for the violation of a taboo was probably left to an inner automatic arrangement. The violated taboo avenged itself. Wherever the taboo was related to ideas of gods and demons, an automatic punishment was expected from the power of the godhead. In other cases, probably as the result of a further development of the idea, society took over the punishment of the offender, whose action has endangered his companions. Thus, man's first systems of punishment are also connected with taboo. Quote, "The violation of taboo makes the offender himself taboo." Unquote. The author goes on to say that certain dangers resulting from the violation of a taboo may be exorcised through acts of penance and ceremonies of purification. A peculiar power inherent in persons and ghosts, which can be transmitted from them to inanimate objects, is regarded as the source of the taboo. This part of the article reads as follows, quote, "Persons or things which are regarded as taboo may be compared to objects charged with electricity. They are the seat of tremendous power which is transmittable by contact, and may be liberated with destructive effect if the organisms which provoke its discharge are too weak to resist it. The result of a violation of taboo depends partly on the strength of the magical influence inherent in the taboo object or person, partly on the strength of the opposing mana of the violator of the taboo. Thus, kings and chiefs are possessed of great power, and it is death for their subjects to address them directly. But a minister or other person of greater mana than common can approach them unharmed, and can in turn be approached by their inferiors without risk. So, too, indirect taboos depend for their strength on the mana of him who opposes them. If it is a chief or priest, they are more powerful than those imposed by a common person." End quote. The fact that a taboo is transmissible has surely given rise to the effort of removing it through expiatory ceremonies. The author states that there are permanent and temporary taboos. The former comprise priests and chiefs as well as the dead and everything that has belonged to them. Temporary taboos attach themselves to certain conditions, such as menstruation and childbed, the status of the warrior before and after the expedition, the activities of fishing and of the chase, and similar activities. A general taboo may also be imposed upon a large district, like an ecclesiastical interdict, and may then last for years. If I judge my readers' impressions correctly, I dare say that after hearing all that was said about taboo, they are far from knowing what to understand by it and where to store it in their minds. This is surely due to the insufficient information I have given, and to the omission of all discussions concerning the relation of taboo to superstition, to belief in the soul, and to religion. On the other hand, I fear that a more detailed description of what is known about taboo would be still more confusing. I can therefore assure the reader that the state of affairs is really far from clear. We may say, however, that we deal with a series of restrictions which these primitive races impose upon themselves. This and that is forbidden without any apparent reason, nor does it occur to them to question this matter, for they subject themselves to these restrictions as a matter of course, and are convinced that any transgression will be punished automatically in the most severe manner. There are reliable reports that innocent transgressions of such prohibitions have actually been punished automatically. For instance, the innocent offender who had eaten from a forbidden animal became deeply depressed, expected his death, and then actually died. The prohibitions mostly concern matters which are capable of enjoyment, such as freedom of movement and unrestrained intercourse. In some cases they appear very ingenious, evidently representing abstinences and renunciations. In other cases their content is quite incomprehensible. They seem to concern themselves with trifles and give the impression of ceremonials. Something like a theory seems to underlie all these prohibitions. It seems as if these prohibitions are necessary because some persons and objects possess a dangerous power which is transmitted by contact with the object so charged, almost like a contagion. The quantity of this dangerous property is also taken into consideration. Some persons or things have more of it than others, and the danger is precisely in accordance with the charge. The most peculiar part of it is that any one who has violated such a prohibition assumes the nature of the forbidden object as if he had absorbed the whole dangerous charge. This power is inherent in all persons who are more or less prominent, such as kings, priests, and the newly born. In all exceptional physical states, such as menstruation, puberty, and birth, in everything sinister like illness and death, and in everything connected with these conditions by virtue of contagion or dissemination. However, the term taboo includes all persons, localities, objects, and temporary conditions which are carriers or sources of this mysterious attribute. The prohibition derived from this attribute is also designated as taboo. And lastly, taboo, in the literal sense, includes everything that is sacred, above the ordinary, and at the same time dangerous, unclean, and mysterious. Both this word and the system corresponding to it express a fragment of psychic life which really is not comprehensible to us. And indeed it would seem that no understanding of it could be possible without entering into the study of the belief in spirits and demons which is so characteristic of these low grades of culture. Now why should we take interest at all in the riddle of taboo? Not only, I think, because every psychological problem is well worth the effort of investigation for its own sake, but for other reasons as well. It may be surmised that the taboo of Polynesian savages is after all not so remote from us as we were at first inclined to believe. The moral and customary prohibitions which we ourselves obey may have some essential relation to this primitive taboo, the explanation of which may in the end throw light upon the dark origin of our own categorical imperative. We are therefore inclined to listen with keen expectations when an investigator like W. Wundt gives his interpretation of taboo, especially as he promises to, quote, go back to the very roots of the taboo concepts, end quote. Wundt states that the idea of taboo includes all customs which express dread of particular objects connected with cultic ideas or of actions having reference to them. On another occasion he says, quote, in accordance with the general sense of the word we understand by taboo every prohibition laid down in customs or manners or in expressly formulated laws, not to touch an object or to take it for one's own use, or to make use of certain prescribed words. End quote. Accordingly, there would not be a single race or stage of culture which had escaped the injurious effects of taboo. Wundt then shows why he finds it more practical to study the nature of taboo in the primitive states of Australian savages rather than in the higher culture of the Polynesian races. In the case of the Australians, he divides taboo prohibitions into three classes according as they concern animals, persons, or other objects. The animal taboo, which consists essentially of the taboo against killing and eating, forms the nucleus of totemism. The taboo of the second class, which has human beings for its object, is of an essentially different nature. To begin with, it is restricted to conditions which bring about an unusual situation in life for the person tabooed. Thus, young men at the feast of initiation, women during menstruation and immediately after delivery, newly born children, the diseased, and especially the dead, are all taboo. The constantly used property of any person, such as his clothes, tools, and weapons, is permanently taboo for everybody else. In Australia, the new name which a youth receives at his initiation into manhood becomes part of his own personal property. It is taboo and must be kept secret. The taboos of the third class, which apply to trees, plants, houses, and localities, are more variable, and seem only to follow the rule that anything which for any reason arouses dread or is mysterious becomes subject to taboo. Wundt himself has to acknowledge that the changes which taboo undergoes in the richer culture of the Polynesians and in the Malayan archipelago are not very profound. The greater social differentiation of these races manifests itself in the fact that chiefs, kings, and priests exercise an especially effective taboo and are themselves exposed to the strongest taboo compulsion. The real sources of taboo lie deeper than in the interests of the privileged classes. They begin where the most primitive and at the same time the most enduring human impulses have their origin, namely in the fear of the effect of demonic powers." The taboo, which originally was nothing more than the objectified fear of the demonic power thought to be concealed in the tabooed object, forbids the irritation of this power and demands the placation of the demon whenever the taboo has been knowingly or unknowingly violated." The taboo then gradually became an autonomous power which has detached itself from demonism. It becomes the compulsion of custom and tradition and finally of the law. "But the commandment concealed behind taboo prohibitions, which differ materially according to place and time, have originally the meaning, 'Beware of the wrath of the demons.'" Wundt therefore teaches that taboo is the expression and evolution of the belief of primitive races in demonic powers, and that later taboo has disassociated itself from this origin and has remained power simply because it was one by virtue of a kind of a psychic persistence, and in this manner it became the root of our customs and laws. As little as one can object to the first part of this statement, I feel, however, that I am only voicing the impression of many of my readers if I call Wundt's explanation disappointing. Wundt's explanation is far from going back to the sources of taboo concepts or to their deepest roots. For neither fear nor demons can be accepted in psychology as finalities defying any further deduction. It would be different if demons really existed, but we know that, like gods, they are only the product of the psychic powers of man. They have been created from and out of something. Wundt also expresses a number of important, though not altogether clear opinions about the double meaning of taboo. According to him, the division between sacred and unclean does not yet exist in the first primitive stages of taboo. For this reason, these conceptions entirely lack the significance which they could only acquire later on when they came to be contrasted. The animal, person, or place on which there is a taboo is demonic, that is, not sacred, and therefore not yet, in the later sense, unclean. The expression taboo is particularly suitable for this undifferentiated and intermediate meaning of the demonic, in the sense of something which may not be touched, since it emphasizes a characteristic which finally adheres both to what is sacred and to the unclean, namely, the dread of contact. But the fact that this important characteristic is permanently held in common points to the existence of an original agreement here between these two spheres, which gave way to a differentiation only as the result of further conditions through which both finally developed into opposites. The belief associated with the original taboo, according to which a demonic power concealed in the object avenges the touching of it or its forbidden use by bewitching the offender, was still an entirely objectified fear. This had not yet separated into the two forms which it assumed at a more developed stage, namely awe and aversion. How did this separation come about? According to Wundt, this was done through the transference of taboo prohibition from the sphere of demons to that of theistic conceptions. The antithesis of sacred and unclean coincides with the succession of two mythological stages, the first of which did not entirely disappear when the second was reached, but continued in a state of greatly lowered esteem, which gradually turned into contempt. It is a general law in mythology that a preceding stage, just because it has been overcome and pushed back by a higher stage, maintains itself next to it in a debased form, so that the objects of its veneration become objects of its aversion. Wundt's further elucidations refer to the relation of taboo to lustration and sacrifice. Section 2. He who approaches the problem of taboo from the field of psychoanalysis, which is concerned with the study of the unconscious part of the individual's psychic life, needs but a moment's reflection to realize that these phenomena are by no means foreign to him. He knows people who have individually created such taboo prohibitions for themselves, which they follow as strictly as savages observe the taboos common to their tribe or society. If he were not accustomed to call these individuals compulsive neurotics, he would find the term taboo disease quite appropriate for their malady. Psychoanalytic investigation has taught him the clinical etiology and the essential part of the psychological mechanism of this compulsion disease, so that he cannot resist applying what he has learnt there to explain corresponding manifestations in folk psychology. There is one warning to which we shall have to give heed in making this attempt. The similarity between taboo and compulsion disease may be purely superficial, holding good only for the manifestations of both, without extending into their deeper characteristics. Nature loves to use identical forms in the most widely different biological connections, as for instance for coral stems in plants, and even for certain crystals, or for the formation of certain chemical precipitates. It would certainly be both premature and unprofitable to base conclusions relating to interrelationships upon the correspondence of merely mechanical conditions. We shall bear this warning in mind, without, however, giving up our intended comparison on account of the possibility of such confusions. The first and most striking correspondence between the compulsion prohibitions of neurotics and taboo lies in the fact that the original of these prohibitions is just as unmotivated and enigmatic. They have appeared at some time or other and must now be retained on account of an unconquerable anxiety. An external threat of punishment is superfluous, because an inner certainty, a conscience, exists that violation will be followed by unbearable disaster. The very most the compulsion patients can tell us is the vague premonition that some person of their environment will suffer harm if they should violate the prohibition. Of what the harm is to consist is not known, and this inadequate information is more likely to be obtained during the later discussions of the expiatory and defensive actions than when the prohibitions themselves are being discussed. As in the case of taboo, the nucleus of the neurotic prohibition is the act of touching, whence we derive the name touching phobia or délire de toucher. The prohibition extends not only to direct contact with the body, but also to the figurative use of the phrase as to come into contact or be in touch with someone or something. Anything that leads the thoughts to what is prohibited and thus calls forth mental contact is just as much prohibited as immediate bodily contact. This same extension is also found in taboo. Some prohibitions are easily understood from their purpose, but others strike us as incomprehensible, foolish, and senseless. We designate such commands as ceremonials, and we find that taboo customs show the same variations. Obsessive prohibitions possess an extraordinary capacity for displacement. They make use of almost any form of connection to extend from one object to another, and then in turn make this new object impossible, as one of my patients aptly puts it. This impossibility finally lays an embargo upon the whole world. The compulsion neurotics act as if the impossible persons and things were the carriers of a dangerous contagion which is ready to displace itself through contact to all neighboring things. We have already emphasized the same characteristics of contagion and transference in the description of taboo prohibitions. We also know that anyone who has violated a taboo by touching something which is taboo becomes taboo himself, and no one may come into contact with him. I shall put side by side two examples of transference, or to use a better term, displacement, one from the life of the Maori and the other from my observation of a woman suffering from a compulsion neurosis. Quote, For a similar reason, a Maori chief would not blow on a fire with his mouth, for his sacred breath would communicate its sanctity to the fire, which would pass it on to the meat in the pot, which would pass it on to the man who ate the meat, which was in the pot, which stood on the fire, which was breathed on by the chief, so that the eater, infected by the chief's breath conveyed through these intermediaries, would surely die." From Frazer, The Golden Bough. My patient demanded that a utensil which her husband had purchased and brought home should be removed lest it make the place where she lives impossible. For she has heard that this object was bought in a store which is situated, let us say, in Stagg Street. But as the word Stagg is the name of a friend, now in a distant city, whom she has known in her youth under her maiden name, and whom she now finds impossible, that is taboo. The object bought in Vienna is just as taboo as this friend with whom she does not want to come in contact. Compulsion prohibitions, like taboo prohibitions, entail the most extraordinary renunciations and restrictions of life, but a part of these can be removed by carrying out certain acts which now also must be done because they have acquired a compulsive character, obsessive acts. There is no doubt that these acts are in the nature of penances, expiations, defense reactions, and purifications. The most common of these obsessive acts is washing with water, washing obsession. A part of the taboo prohibitions can also be replaced in this way, that is to say, their violation can be made good through such a ceremonial, and here too lustration through water is the preferred way. Let us now summarize the points in which the correspondence between taboo customs and symptoms of compulsion neurosis are most clearly manifested. 1. In the lack of motivation of the commandments. 2. In their enforcement through an inner need. 3. In their capacity of displacement and in the danger of contagion from what is prohibited. 4. And in the causation of ceremonial actions and commandments which emanate from the forbidden. However, psychoanalysis has made us familiar with the clinical history as well as the psychic mechanism of compulsion neurosis. Thus, the history of a typical case of touching phobia reads as follows. In the very beginning, during the early period of childhood, the person manifested a strong pleasure in touching himself, the object of which was much more specialized than one would be inclined to expect. Presently, the carrying out of this very pleasurable act of touching was opposed by a prohibition from without. Both the pleasure and the prohibition referred to touching one's own genitals. The prohibition was accepted because it was supported by strong inner forces. The relation to beloved persons who imposed the prohibition. It proved to be stronger than the impulse which wanted to manifest itself through this act of touching. But due to the primitive psychic constitution of the child, this prohibition did not succeed in abolishing the impulse. Its only success lay in repressing the impulse, pleasure of touching, and banishing it into the unconscious. Both the prohibition and the impulse remained. The impulse because it had only been repressed and not abolished, the prohibition because if it had ceased, the impulse would have broken through into consciousness and would have been carried out. An unsolved situation, psychic fixation, had thus been created, and now everything else emanated from the continued conflict between prohibition and impulse. The main characteristic of the psychic constellation which has thus undergone fixation lies in what one might call the ambivalent behavior. To use an excellent term coined by Bleuler. Ambivalent behavior of the individual to the object, or rather to an action regarding it. The individual constantly wants to carry out this action, the act of touching. He sees in it the highest pleasure, but he may not carry it out, and he even abominates it. The opposition between these two streams cannot be easily adjusted because there is no other way to express it. They are so localized in the psychic life that they cannot meet. The prohibition becomes fully conscious, while the surviving pleasure of touching remains unconscious, the person knowing nothing about it. If this psychological factor did not exist, the ambivalence could neither maintain itself so long nor lead to such subsequent manifestations. In the clinical history of the case we have emphasized the appearance of the prohibition in early childhood as the determining factor, but for the further elaboration of the neurosis this role is played by the repression which appears at this age. On account of the repression which has taken place, which is connected with forgetting (amnesia), the motivation of the prohibition that has become conscious remains unknown, and all attempts to unravel it intellectually must fail, as the point of attack cannot be found. The prohibition owes its strength, its compulsive character, to its association with its unknown counterpart, the hidden and unabated pleasure, that is to say, to an inner need in which conscious insight is lacking. The transferability and reproductive power of the prohibition reflect a process which harmonizes with the unconscious pleasure and is very much facilitated through the psychological determinants of the unconscious. The pleasure of the impulse constantly undergoes displacement in order to escape the blocking which it encounters, and seeks to acquire surrogates for the forbidden in the form of substitutive objects and actions. For the same reason the prohibition also wanders and spreads to the new aims of the proscribed impulse. Every new advance of the repressed libido is answered by the prohibition with a new severity. The mutual inhibition of these two contending forces creates a need for discharge and for lessening the existing tension, in which we may recognize the motivation for the compulsive acts. In the neurosis there are distinctly acts of compromise, which on the one hand may be regarded as proofs of remorse and efforts to expiate and similar actions, but on the other hand they are at the same time substitutive actions, which recompense the impulse for what has been forbidden. It is a law of neurotic diseases that these obsessive acts serve the impulse more and more and come nearer and nearer to the original forbidden act. We may now make the attempt to study taboo as if it were of the same nature as the compulsive prohibitions of our patients. It must naturally be clearly understood that many of the taboo prohibitions which we shall study are already secondary, displaced and distorted, so that we shall have to be satisfied if we can shed some light upon the earliest and most important taboo prohibitions. We must also remember that the differences in the situation of the savage and of the neurotic may be important enough to exclude complete correspondence and prevent a point-by-point transfer from one to the other, such as would be possible if we were dealing with exact copies. First of all, it must be said that it is useless to question savages as to the real motivation of their prohibitions or as to the genesis of taboo. According to our assumption, they must be incapable of telling us anything about it, since this motivation is unconscious to them. But following the model of the compulsive prohibition, we shall construct the history of a taboo as follows. Taboos are very ancient prohibitions which at one time were forced upon a generation of primitive people from without. That is, they probably were forcibly impressed upon them by an earlier generation. These prohibitions concern actions for which there existed a strong desire. The prohibitions maintained themselves from generation to generation, perhaps only as the result of a tradition set up by paternal and social authority. But in later generations they have perhaps already become organized as a piece of inherited psychic property. Whether they are such innate ideas or whether these have brought about the fixation of the taboo by themselves or by cooperating with education, no one could decide in the particular case in question. The persistence of taboo teaches, however, one thing, namely, that the original pleasure to do the forbidden still continues among the taboo races. They therefore assume an ambivalent attitude toward their taboo prohibitions. In their unconscious they would like nothing better than to transgress them, but they are also afraid to do it. They are afraid just because they would like to transgress, and the fear is stronger than the pleasure. But in every individual of the race the desire for it is unconscious, just as in the neurotic. The oldest and most important taboo prohibitions are the two basic laws of totemism. Namely, not to kill the totem animal and to avoid sexual intercourse with totem companions of the other sex. It would therefore seem that these must have been the oldest and strongest desires of mankind. We cannot understand this, and therefore we cannot use these examples to test our assumptions as long as the meaning and the origin of the totemic system is so wholly unknown to us. But the very wording of these taboos and the fact that they occur together will remind anyone who knows the results of the psychoanalytic investigation of individuals of something quite definite which psychoanalysts call the central point of the infantile wish life and the nucleus of the later neurosis. All other varieties of taboo phenomena which have led to the attempted classifications noted above become unified if we sum them up in the following sentence. The basis of taboo is a forbidden action for which there exists a strong inclination in the unconscious. We know, without understanding it, that whoever does what is prohibited and violates the taboo becomes himself taboo. But how can we connect this fact with the other, namely, that the taboo adheres not only to persons who have done what is prohibited, but also to persons who are in exceptional circumstances, to these circumstances themselves, and to impersonal things? What can this dangerous attribute be, which always remains the same under all these different conditions? Only one thing, namely, the propensity to arouse the ambivalence of man and to tempt him to violate the prohibition. An individual who has violated a taboo becomes himself taboo because he has the dangerous property of tempting others to follow his example. He arouses envy. Why should he be allowed to do what is prohibited to others? He is therefore really contagious, in so far as every example incites to imitation, and therefore he himself must be avoided. But a person may become permanently or temporarily taboo without having violated any taboos, for the simple reason that he is in a condition which has the property of inciting the forbidden desires of others, and of awakening the ambivalent conflict in them. Most of the exceptional positions and conditions have this character and possess this dangerous power. The king or chieftain rouses envy of his prerogatives. Everybody would perhaps like to be king. The dead, the newly born, and women when they are incapacitated, all act as incitements on account of their peculiar helplessness, while the individual who has just reached sexual maturity tempts through the promise of a new pleasure. Therefore all these persons and all their conditions are taboo, for one must not yield to the temptations which they offer. Now, too, we understand why the forces inherent in the mana of various persons can neutralize one another so that the mana of one individual can partly cancel that of the other. The taboo of a king is too strong for his subject because the social difference between them is too great. But a minister, for example, can become the harmless mediator between them. Translated from the language of taboo into the language of normal psychology, this means the subject who shrinks from the tremendous temptation which contact with the king creates for him can brook the intercourse of an official whom he does not have to envy so much and whose position perhaps seems attainable to him. The minister, on his part, can moderate his envy of the king by taking into consideration the power that has been granted to him. Thus, smaller differences in the magic power that lead to temptation are less to be feared than exceptionally big differences. It is equally clear how the violation of certain taboo prohibitions becomes a social danger which must be punished or expiated by all the members of society, lest it harm them all. This danger really exists if we substitute the known impulses for the unconscious desires. It consists in the possibility of imitation, as a result of which society would soon be dissolved. If the others did not punish the violation, they would perforce become aware that they want to imitate the evildoer. Though the secret meaning of a taboo prohibition cannot possibly be of so special a nature as in the case of a neurosis, we must not be astonished to find that touching plays a similar role in taboo prohibition as in the délire de toucher. To touch is the beginning of every act of possession, of every attempt to make use of a person or thing. We have interpreted the power of contagion which inheres in the taboo as the property of leading into temptation and of inciting to imitation. This does not seem to be in accord with the fact that the contagiousness of the taboo is above all manifested in the transference to objects which thus themselves become carriers of the taboo. This transferability of the taboo reflects what is found in the neurosis, namely the constant tendency of the unconscious impulse to become displaced through associative channels upon new objects. Our attention is thus drawn to the fact that the dangerous magic power of the mana corresponds to two real faculties, the capacity of reminding man of his forbidden wishes, and the apparently more important one of tempting him to violate the prohibition in the service of these wishes. Both functions reunite into one, however, if we assume it to be in accord with a primitive psychic life that with the awakening of a memory of a forbidden action, there should also be combined the awakening of the tendency to carry out the action. Memory and temptation then again coincide. We must also admit that if the example of a person who has violated a prohibition leads another to the same action, the disobedience of the prohibition has been transmitted like a contagion, just as the taboo is transferred from a person to an object and from this to another. If the violation of a taboo can be condoned through expiation or penance, which means, of course, a renunciation of a possession or a liberty, we have the proof that the observance of a taboo regulation was itself a renunciation of something really wished for. The omission of one renunciation is cancelled through a renunciation at some other point. This would lead us to conclude that as far as taboo ceremonials are concerned, penance is more primitive than purification. Let us now summarize what understanding we have gained of taboo through its comparison with the compulsive prohibition of the neurotic. Taboo is very primitive prohibition imposed from without, by an authority, and directed against the strongest desires of man. The desire to violate it continues in the unconscious. Persons who obey the taboo have an ambivalent feeling toward what is affected by the taboo. The magic power attributed to the taboo goes back to its ability to lead man into temptation. It behaves like a contagion because the example is contagious, and because the prohibited desire becomes displacing in the unconscious upon something else. The expiation for the violation of a taboo through a renunciation proves that a renunciation is at the basis of the observance of the taboo. Section 3. We may ask what we have gained from the comparison of taboo with compulsion neurosis, and what value can be claimed for the interpretation we have given on the basis of this comparison. Our interpretation is evidently of no value unless it offers an advantage not to be had in any other way, and unless it affords a better understanding of taboo than was otherwise possible. We might claim that we have already given proof of its usefulness in what has been said above. But we shall have to try to strengthen our proof by continuing the explanation of taboo prohibitions and customs in detail. But we can avail ourselves of another method. We can shape our investigation so as to ascertain whether a part of the assumptions which we have transferred from the neurosis to the taboo, or the conclusions at which we have thereby arrived, can be demonstrated directly in the phenomena of taboo. We must decide, however, what we want to look for. The assertion concerning the genesis of taboo, namely, that it was derived from a primitive prohibition which was once imposed from without, cannot, of course, be proved. We shall therefore seek to confirm those psychological conditions for taboo with which we have become acquainted in the case of compulsion neurosis. How did we gain our knowledge of these psychological factors in the case of neurosis? Through the analytical study of the symptoms, especially the compulsive actions, the defense reactions, and the obsessive commands. These mechanisms gave every indication of having been derived from ambivalent impulses or tendencies. They either represented simultaneously the wish and counter-wish, or they served preponderantly one of the two contrary tendencies. If we should now succeed in showing that ambivalence, that is, the sway of contrary tendencies, exists also in the case of taboo regulations, or if we should find among the taboo mechanisms some which, like neurotic obsessions, give simultaneous expression to both currents, we would have established what is practically the most important point in the psychological correspondence between taboo and compulsion neurosis. We have already mentioned that the two fundamental taboo prohibitions are inaccessible to our analysis because they belong to totemism. Another part of the taboo rules is of secondary origin and cannot be used for our purpose. For among these races, taboo has become the general form of law-giving and has helped to promote social tendencies which are certainly younger than taboo itself, as, for instance, the taboos imposed by chiefs and priests to ensure their property and privileges. But there still remains a large group of laws which we may undertake to investigate. Among these I lay stress on those taboos which are attached (a) to enemies, (b) to chiefs, and (c) to the dead. The material for our investigation is taken from the excellent collection of J.G. Frazer in his great work, The Golden Bough. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Chapter 2, Part 2. A. The treatment of enemies. Inclined as we may have been to ascribe to savage and semi-savage races uninhibited and remorseless cruelty towards their enemies, it is of great interest to us to learn that with them too the killing of a person compels the observation of a series of rules which are associated with taboo customs. These rules are easily brought under 4 groups. They demand 1. Reconciliation with the slain enemy, 2. Restrictions, 3. Acts of expiation and purifications of the manslayer, and 4. Certain ceremonial rites. The incomplete reports do not allow us to decide with certainty how general or how isolated such taboo customs may be among these races. But this is a matter of indifference as far as our interest in these occurrences is concerned. Still, it may be assumed that we are dealing with widespread customs and not with isolated peculiarities. The reconciliation customs practiced on the island of Timor after a victorious band of warriors has returned with the severed heads of the vanquished enemy are especially significant because the leader of the expedition is subject to heavy additional restrictions. Quote from Frazer. At the solemn entry of the victors, sacrifices are made to conciliate the souls of the enemy. Otherwise, one would have to expect harm to come to the victors. A dance is given and a song is sung in which the slain enemy is mourned and his forgiveness is implored. Be not angry, they say, because your head is here with us. Had we been less lucky, our heads might have been exposed in your village. We have offered the sacrifice to appease you. Your spirit may now rest and leave us at peace. Why were you our enemy? Would it not have been better that we should remain friends? Then your blood would not have been spilt, and your head would not have been cut off. End quote. Similar customs are found among the Palu in Celebes. The Gallas sacrifice to the spirits of their dead enemies before they return to their home villages. Other races have found methods of making friends, guardians, and protectors out of their former enemies after they are dead. This consists in the tender treatment of the severed heads, of which many wild tribes of Borneo boast. When the Sea Dayaks of Sarawak bring home a head from a war expedition, they treat it for months with the greatest kindness and courtesy, and address it with the most endearing names in their language. The best morsels from their meals are put into its mouth, together with tidbits and cigars. The dead enemy is repeatedly entreated to hate his former friends and to bestow his love upon his new hosts because he has now become one of them. It would be a great mistake to think that any derision is attached to this treatment, horrible though it may seem to us. Observers have been struck by the mourning for the enemy after he is slain and scalped among several of the wild tribes of North America. When a Choctaw had killed an enemy, he began a month's mourning during which he submitted himself to serious restrictions. The Dakota Indians mourned in the same way. One authority mentions that the Osage Indians, after mourning for their own dead, mourned for their foes as if they had been friends. Before proceeding to the other classes of taboo customs for the treatment of enemies, we must define our position in regard to a pertinent objection. Both Frazer, as well as other authorities, may well be quoted against us to show that the motive for these rules of reconciliation is quite simple and has nothing to do with ambivalence. These races are dominated by a superstitious fear of the spirits of the slain, a fear which was also familiar to classical antiquity, and which the great British dramatist brought upon the stage in the hallucinations of Macbeth and Richard III. From this superstition, all the reconciliation rules, as well as the restrictions and expiations which we shall discuss later, can be logically deduced. Moreover, the ceremonies included in the 4th group also argue for this interpretation, since the only explanation of which they admit is the effort to drive away the spirits of the slain which pursue the manslayers. Besides, the savages themselves directly admit their fear of the spirits of their slain foes and trace back the taboo customs under discussion to this fear. This objection is certainly pertinent, and if it were adequate as well, we would gladly spare ourselves the trouble of our attempt to find a further explanation. We postpone the consideration of this objection until later, and for the present merely contrast it to the interpretation derived from our previous discussion of taboo. All these rules of taboo lead us to conclude that other impulses besides those that are merely hostile find expression in the behavior towards enemies. We see in them manifestations of repentance, a regard for the enemy, and of a bad conscience for having slain him. It seems that the commandment, "Thou shalt not slay," which could not be violated without punishment, existed also among these savages, long before any legislation was received from the hands of a god. We now return to the remaining classes of taboo rules. The restrictions laid upon the victorious manslayer are unusually frequent and are mostly of a serious nature. In Timor, compare the reconciliation customs mentioned above, the leader of the expedition cannot return to his house under any circumstances. A special hut is erected for him in which he spends 2 months engaged in the observance of various rules of purification. During this period he may not see his wife or nourish himself. Another person must put his food into his mouth. Among some Dayak tribes, warriors returning from a successful expedition must remain sequestered for several days and abstain from certain foods. They may not touch iron and must remain away from their wives. In Logia, an island near New Guinea, men who have killed an enemy or have taken part in the killing lock themselves up in their houses for a week. They avoid every intercourse with their wives and friends. They do not touch their victuals with their hands and live on nothing but vegetable foods which are cooked for them in special dishes. As a reason for this last restriction, it is alleged that they must smell the blood of the slain. Otherwise they would sicken and die. Among the Toaripi or Motu Motu tribes of New Guinea, a manslayer must not approach his wife and must not touch his food with his fingers. A second person must feed him with special food. This continues until the next new moon. I avoid the complete enumeration of all the cases of restrictions of the victorious slayer mentioned by Fraser, and emphasize only such cases in which the character of taboo is especially noticeable, or where the restriction appears in connection with expiation, purification, and ceremonial. Among the Monumbos in German New Guinea, a man who has killed an enemy in combat becomes unclean, the same word being employed which is applied to women during menstruation or confinement. For a considerable period he is not allowed to leave the men's clubhouse, while the inhabitants of his village gather about him and celebrate his victory with songs and dances. He must not touch anyone, not even his wife and children. If he did so, they would be afflicted with boils. He finally becomes clean through washing and other ceremonies. Among the Natchez in North America, young warriors who had procured their first scalp were bound for 6 months to the observance of certain renunciations. They were not allowed to sleep with their wives or to eat meat, and received only fish and maize pudding as nourishment. When a Choctaw had killed and scalped an enemy, he began a period of mourning for 1 month, during which he was not allowed to comb his hair. When his head itched, he was not allowed to scratch it with his hand, but used a small stick for this purpose. After a Pima Indian had killed an Apache, he had to submit himself to severe ceremonies of purification and expiation. During a fasting period of 16 days, he was not allowed to touch meat or salt, to look at a fire, or to speak to anyone. He lived alone in the woods, where he was waited upon by an old woman who brought him a small allowance of food. He often bathed in the nearest river, and carried a lump of clay on his head as a sign of mourning. On the 17th day there took place a public ceremony through which he and his weapons were solemnly purified. As the Pima Indians took the manslayer taboo much more seriously than their enemies, and unlike them did not postpone expiation and purification until the end of the expedition, their prowess in war suffered very much through their moral severity, or what might be called their piety. In spite of their extraordinary bravery, they proved to be unsatisfactory allies to the Americans in their wars against the Apaches. The detail and variations of these expiatory and purifying ceremonies after the killing of an enemy would be most interesting for purposes of a more searching study, but I need not enumerate any more of them here, because they cannot furnish us with any new points of view. I might mention that the temporary or permanent isolation of the professional executioner, which was maintained up to our time, is a case in point. The position of the freeholder in medieval society really conveys a good idea of the taboo of savages. The current explanation of all these rules of reconciliation, restriction, expiation, and purification combines two principles, namely, the extension of the taboo of the dead to everything that has come into contact with him, and the fear of the spirit of the slain. In what combination these two elements are to explain the ceremonial, whether they are to be considered as of equal value, or whether one of them is primary and the other secondary, and which one is nowhere stated. Nor would this be an easy matter to decide. In contradistinction to all this, we emphasize the unity which our interpretation gains by deducing all these rules from the ambivalence of the emotion of savages toward their enemies. B. The taboo of rulers. The behavior of primitive races toward their chiefs, kings, and priests is controlled by two principles which seem rather to supplement than to contradict each other. They must both be guarded and be guarded against. Both objects are accomplished through innumerable rules of taboo. Why one must guard against rulers is already known to us, because they are the bearers of that mysterious and dangerous magic power which communicates itself by contact, like an electrical charge, bringing death and destruction to anyone not protected by a similar charge. All direct or indirect contact with this dangerous sacredness is therefore avoided. And where it cannot be avoided, a ceremonial has been found to ward off the dreaded consequences. The Nubas in East Africa, for instance, believe that they must die if they enter the house of their priest king, but that they escape this danger if on entering they bare the left shoulder and induce the king to touch it with his hand. Thus we have the remarkable case of the king's touch becoming the healing and protective measure against the very dangers that arise from contact with the king. But it is probably a question of the healing power of the intentional touching on the king's part in contradistinction to the danger of touching him. In other words, of the opposition between passivity and activity towards the king. Where the healing power of the royal touch is concerned, we do not have to look for examples among savages. In comparatively recent times, the kings of England exercised this power upon scrofula, whence it was called the king's evil. Neither Queen Elizabeth nor any of her successors renounced this part of the royal prerogative. Charles I is said to have healed 100 sufferers at one time in the year 1633. Under his dissolute son, Charles II, after the great English Revolution had passed, royal healings of scrofula attained their greatest vogue. This king is said to have touched close to 100,000 victims of scrofula in the course of his reign. The crush of those seeking to be cured used to be so great that on one occasion 6 or 7 patients suffered death by suffocation instead of being healed. The skeptical king of Orange, William III, who became king of England after the banishment of the Stuarts, refused to exercise the spell. On the one occasion when he consented to practice the touch, he did so with the words, "May God give you better health and more sense." The following account will bear witness to the terrible effect of touching, by virtue of which a person, even though unintentionally, becomes active against his king or against what belongs to him. A chief of high rank and great holiness in New Zealand happened to leave the remains of his meal by the roadside. A young slave came along, a strong, healthy fellow, who saw what was left over and started to eat it. Hardly had he finished when a horrified spectator informed him of his offense in eating the meal of the chief. The man had been a strong, brave warrior, but as soon as he heard this he collapsed and was afflicted by terrible convulsions, from which he died towards sunset of the following day. A Maori woman ate a certain fruit and then learned that it came from a place on which there was a taboo. She cried out that the spirit of the chief whom she had thus offended would surely kill her. This incident occurred in the afternoon, and on the next day at 12 o'clock she was dead. The tinderbox of a Maori chief once cost several persons their lives. The chief had lost it, and those who found it used it to light their pipes. When they learned whose property the tinderbox was, they all died of fright. It is hardly astonishing that the need was felt to isolate dangerous persons, like chiefs and priests, by building a wall around them which made them inaccessible to others. We surmise that this wall, which originally was constructed out of taboo rules, still exists today in the form of court ceremony. But probably the greater part of this taboo of the rulers cannot be traced back to the need of guarding against them. The other point of view in the treatment of privileged persons, the need of guarding them from dangers with which they are threatened, has had a distinct share in the creation of taboo and therefore of the origin of court etiquette. The necessity of guarding the king from every conceivable danger arises from his great importance for the weal and woe of his subjects. Strictly speaking, he is a person who regulates the course of the world. His people have to thank him not only for rain and sunshine, which allow the fruits of the earth to grow, but also for the wind, which brings the ships to their shores, and for the solid ground on which they set their feet. These savage kings are endowed with a wealth of power and an ability to bestow happiness which only gods possess. Certainly in later stages of civilization, none but the most servile courtiers would play the hypocrite to the extent of crediting their sovereigns with the possession of attributes similar to these. It seems like an obvious contradiction that persons of such perfection of power should themselves require the greatest care to guard them against threatening dangers. But this is not the only contradiction revealed in the treatment of royal persons on the part of savages. These races consider it necessary to watch over their kings, to see that they use their powers in the right way. They are by no means sure of their good intentions or of their conscientiousness. A strain of mistrust is mingled with the motivation of the taboo rules for the king. The idea that early kingdoms are despotisms, says Fraser, in which the people exist only for the sovereign, is wholly inapplicable to the monarchies we are considering. On the contrary, the sovereign in them exists only for his subjects. His life is only valuable so long as he discharges the duties of his position by ordering the course of nature for his people's benefit. So soon as he fails to do so, the care, the devotion, the religious homage which they had hitherto lavished on him cease and are changed into hatred and contempt. He is ignominiously dismissed and may be thankful if he escapes with his life. Worshipped as a god one day, he is killed as a criminal the next. But in this changed behavior of the people there is nothing capricious or inconsistent. On the contrary, their conduct is quite consistent. If their king is their god, he is, or should be, also their preserver. And if he will not preserve them, he must make room for another who will. So long, however, as he answers their expectations, there is no limit to the care which they take of him, and which they compel him to take of himself. A king of this sort lives hedged in by ceremonious etiquette, a network of prohibitions and observances of which the intention is not to contribute to his dignity, much less to his comfort, but to restrain him from conduct which, by disturbing the harmony of nature, might involve himself, his people, and the universe in one common catastrophe. Far from adding to his comfort, these observances, by trammeling his every act, annihilate his freedom and often render the very life which it is their object to preserve a burden and sorrow to him. One of the most glaring examples of thus fettering and paralyzing a holy ruler through taboo ceremonial seems to have been reached in the life routine of the Mikado of Japan, as it existed in earlier centuries. A description which is now over 200 years old relates, quote, from Kempfer, History of Japan. He thinks that it would be very prejudicial to his dignity and holiness to touch the ground with his feet. For this reason, when he intends to go anywhere, he must be carried thither on men's shoulders. Much less will they suffer that he should expose his sacred person to the open air, and the sun is not thought worthy to shine on his head. There is such a holiness ascribed to all the parts of his body that he dares to cut off neither his hair, nor his beard, nor his nails. However, lest he should grow too dirty, they may clean him in the night when he is asleep, because they say that what is taken from the body at that time hath been stolen from him, and that such a theft does not prejudice his holiness or dignity. In ancient times he was obliged to sit on the throne for some hours every morning, with the imperial crown on his head, but to sit altogether like a statue, without stirring either hands or feet, head or eyes, nor indeed any part of his body, because by this means it was thought that he could preserve peace and tranquillity in his empire. For if unfortunately he turned himself on one side or other, or if he looked a good while towards any part of his dominion, it was apprehended that war, famine, fire, or some other great misfortune was near at hand to desolate the country." End quote. Some of the taboos to which barbarian kings are subject vividly recall the restrictions placed on murderers. On Shark Point, at Cape Padron, in Lower Guinea, West Africa, a priest-king called Kukulu lives alone in a woods. He is not allowed to touch a woman or to leave his house, and cannot even rise out of his chair, in which he must sleep in a sitting position. If he should lie down, the wind would cease, and the shipping would be disturbed. It is his function to keep storms in check, and in general to see to an even, healthy condition of the atmosphere. The more powerful a king of Loango is, says Bastian, the more taboos he must observe. The heir to the throne is also bound to them from childhood on. They accumulate about him while he is growing up, and by the time of his accession he is suffocated by them. Our interest in the matter does not require us to take up more space to describe more fully the taboos that cling to royal and priestly dignity. We merely add that restrictions as to freedom of movement and diet play the main role among them. But two examples of taboo ceremonial taken from civilized nations, and therefore from much higher stages of culture, will indicate to what an extent association with these privileged persons tends to preserve ancient customs. The Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter in Rome, had to observe an extraordinarily large number of taboo rules. He was not allowed to ride, to see a horse or an armed man, to wear a ring that was not broken, to have a knot in his garments, to touch wheat flour or leaven, or even to mention by name a goat, a dog, raw meat, beans, and ivy. His hair could only be cut by a free man and with a bronze knife. His hair combings and nail parings had to be buried under a lucky tree. He could not touch the dead, go into the open with a bare head, and similar prohibitions. His wife, the Flaminica, also had her own prohibitions. She was not allowed to ascend more than 3 steps on a certain kind of stairs, and on certain holidays she could not comb her hair. The leather for her shoes could not be taken from any animal that had died a natural death, but only from one that had been slaughtered or sacrificed. When she heard thunder, she was unclean until she had made an expiatory sacrifice. The old kings of Ireland were subject to a series of very curious restrictions, the observance of which was expected to bring every blessing to the country, while their violation entailed every form of evil. The complete description of these taboos is given in the Book of Rites, of which the oldest manuscript copies bear the dates 1390 and 1418. The prohibitions are very detailed and concern certain activities at specified places and times. In some cities, for instance, the king cannot stay on a certain day of the week, while at some specified hour this or that river may not be crossed. Or again, there is a plain on which he cannot camp a full 9 days, etc. Among many savage races, the severity of the taboo restrictions for the priest-kings has had results of historic importance, which are especially interesting from our point of view. The honor of being a priest-king ceased to be desirable. The person in line for the succession often used every means to escape it. Thus, in Cambodia, where there is a fire and water king, it is often necessary to use force to compel the successor to accept the honor. On Niue, or Savage Island, a coral island in the Pacific Ocean, monarchy actually came to an end because nobody was willing to undertake the responsible and dangerous office. In some parts of West Africa, a general council is held after the death of the king to determine upon the successor. The man on whom the choice falls is seized, tied, and kept in custody in the fetish house until he has declared himself willing to accept the crown. Sometimes the presumptive successor to the throne finds ways and means to avoid the intended honor. Thus it is related of a certain chief that he used to go armed day and night and resist by force every attempt to place him on the throne. Among the Negroes of Sierra Leone, the resistance against accepting the kingly honor was so great that most of the tribes were compelled to make strangers their kings. Fraser makes these conditions responsible for the fact that in the development of history, a separation of the original priest kingship into a spiritual and a secular power finally took place. Kings, crushed by the burden of their holiness, became incapable of exercising their power over real things, and had to leave this to inferior but executive persons who were willing to renounce the honors of royal dignity. From these there grew up the secular rulers, while the spiritual overlordship, which was now of no practical importance, was left to the former taboo kings. It is well known to what extent this hypothesis finds confirmation in the history of old Japan. A survey of the picture of the relations of primitive peoples to their rulers gives rise to the expectation that our advance from description to psychoanalytic understanding will not be difficult. These relations are of an involved nature and are not free from contradictions. Rulers are granted great privileges which are practically cancelled by taboo prohibitions in regard to other privileges. They are privileged persons. They can do or enjoy what is withheld from the rest through taboo. But in contrast to this freedom, they are restricted by other taboos, which do not affect the ordinary individual. Here, therefore, is the first contrast, which amounts almost to a contradiction, between an excess of freedom and an excess of restriction as applied to the same persons. They are credited with extraordinary magic powers, and contact with their person or their property is therefore feared, while on the other hand the most beneficial effect is expected from these contacts. This seems to be a second and an especially glaring contradiction, but we have already learned that it is only apparent. The king's touch, exercised by him with benevolent intention, heals and protects. It is only when a common man touches the king or his royal effects that the contact becomes dangerous, and this is probably because the act may recall aggressive tendencies. Another contradiction, which is not so easily solved, is expressed in the fact that great power over the processes of nature is ascribed to the ruler, and yet the obligation is felt to guard him with especial care against threatening dangers, as if his own power, which can do so much, were incapable of accomplishing this. A further difficulty in the relation arises because there is no confidence that the ruler will use his tremendous power to the advantage of his subjects, as well as for his own protection. He is therefore distrusted, and surveillance over him is considered to be justified. The taboo etiquette, to which the life of the king is subject, simultaneously serves all these objects of exercising a tutelage over the king, of guarding him against dangers, and of guarding his subjects against danger which he brings to them. We are inclined to give the following explanation of the complicated and contradictory relation of primitive peoples to their rulers. Through superstition as well as through other motives, various tendencies find expression in the treatment of kings, each of which is developed to the extreme without regard to the others. As a result of this, contradictions arise at which the intellect of savages takes no more offense than a highly civilized person would, as long as it is only a question of religious matters or of loyalty. That would be so far so good, but the psychoanalytic technique may enable us to penetrate more deeply into the matter and to add something about the nature of these various tendencies. If we subject the facts as stated to analysis just as if they formed the symptoms of a neurosis, our first attention would be directed to the excessive anxious worry, which is said to be the cause of the taboo ceremonial. The occurrence of such excessive tenderness is very common in the neurosis, and especially in the compulsion neurosis, upon which we are drawing primarily for our comparison. We now thoroughly understand the origin of this tenderness. It occurs wherever, besides the predominant tenderness, there exists a contrary but unconscious stream of hostility, that is to say, where the typical case of an ambivalent affective attitude is realized. The hostility is then cried down by an excessive increase of tenderness, which is expressed as anxiety and becomes compulsive because otherwise it would not suffice for its task of keeping the unconscious opposition in a state of repression. Every psychoanalyst knows how infallibly this anxious excess of tenderness can be resolved even under the most improbable circumstances, as for instance when it appears between mother and child, or in the case of affectionate married people. Applied to the treatment of privileged persons, this theory of an ambivalent feeling would reveal that their veneration, their very deification, is opposed in the unconscious by an intense hostile tendency, so that, as we had expected, the situation of an ambivalent feeling is here realized. The distrust, which certainly seems to contribute to the motivation of the royal taboo, would be another direct manifestation of the same unconscious hostility. Indeed, the ultimate issues of this conflict show such a diversity among different races that we would not be at a loss for examples in which the proof of such hostility would be much easier. We learn from Fraser that the savage Timmys of Sierra Leone reserve the right to administer a beating to their elected king on the evening before his coronation, and that they make use of this constitutional right with such thoroughness that the unhappy ruler sometimes does not long survive his accession to the throne. For this reason, the leaders of the race have made it a rule to elect some man against whom they have a particular grudge. Nevertheless, even in such glaring cases, the hostility is not acknowledged as such, but is expressed as if it were a ceremonial. Another trait in the attitude of primitive races toward their rulers recalls a mechanism which is universally present in mental disturbances and is openly revealed in the so-called delusions of persecution. Here the importance of a particular person is extraordinarily heightened, and his omnipotence is raised to the improbable, in order to make it easier to attribute to him the responsibility for everything painful which happens to the patient. Savages really do not act differently towards their rulers when they ascribe to them power over rain and shine, wind and weather, and then dethrone or kill them because nature has disappointed their expectation of a good hunt or a ripe harvest. The prototype which the paranoiac reconstructs in his persecution mania is found in the relation of the child to its father. Such omnipotence is regularly attributed to the father in the imagination of the son, and distrust of the father has been shown to be intimately connected with the highest esteem for him. When a paranoiac names a person of his acquaintance as his persecutor, he thereby elevates him to the paternal succession and brings him under conditions which enable him to make him responsible for all the misfortune which he experiences. Thus, this second analogy between the savage and the neurotic may allow us to surmise how much in the relation of the savage to his ruler arises from the infantile attitude of the child to its father. But the strongest support for our point of view, which seeks to compare taboo prohibitions with neurotic symptoms, is to be found in the taboo ceremonial itself, the significance of which, for the status of kinship, has already been subject of our previous discussion. This ceremonial unmistakably reveals its double meaning and its origin from ambivalent tendencies, if only we are willing to assume that the effects it produces are those which it intended from the very beginning. It not only distinguishes kings and elevates them above all ordinary mortals, but it also makes their life a torture and an unbearable burden, and forces them into a thraldom which is far worse than that of their subjects. It would thus be the correct counterpart to the compulsive action of the neurosis, in which the suppressed impulse and the impulse which suppresses it meet in mutual and simultaneous satisfaction. The compulsive action is nominally a protection against the forbidden action, but we would say that actually it is a repetition of what is forbidden. The word nominally is here applied to the conscious, whereas the word actually applies to the unconscious instance of the psychic life. Thus also the taboo ceremonial of kings is nominally an expression of the highest veneration and a means of guarding them. Actually, it is the punishment for their elevation, the revenge which their subjects take upon them. The experiences which Cervantes makes Sancho Panza undergo as governor on his island have evidently made him recognize this interpretation of courtly ceremonial as the only correct one. It is very possible that this point would be corroborated if we could induce kings and rulers of today to express themselves on this point. Why the emotional attitude toward rulers should contain such a strong unconscious share of hostility is a very interesting problem, which, however, exceeds the scope of this book. We have already referred to the infantile father complex. We may add that an investigation of the early history of kingship would bring the decisive explanations. Fraser has an impressive discussion of the theory that the first kings were strangers, who after a short reign were destined to be sacrificed at solemn festivals as representatives of the deity. But Fraser himself does not consider his facts altogether convincing. Christian myths are said to have been still influenced by the after effects of this evolution of kings. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.